Hi everyone, this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and we are continuing with our webinar series in international arbitration in the energy and mining sectors. So if you've been following the webinars, you would know that this is a book project. It's a live book project edited by Dr. Victoria Nalule, that's me, and Professor Damilola Olawi. So in today's webinar, in today's session, where I'll be hosting Dr. Rahmi Kopa, who is an energy arbitrator at the Energy Disputes Arbitration Center based in Turkey, and he's also a visiting fellow at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral and Policy at the University of Dundee. So his book chapter is focused on due diligence of international energy investors, and he's going to be taking us through a summary of his book chapter, some of the key findings, what he covers in the book, and then afterwards he'll give us a few concluding remarks. But remember, the book project, the book itself, it's a live book project with over 50 chapters, and his book chapter is also a big chapter, but obviously in today's webinar, we just want to summarize some of the key issues or his key findings with respect to his book chapter. But before we start, I would like Dr. Copper to briefly introduce himself, to tell us more about his professional background, and he can also tell us about his recently published book in international energy law. Dr. Copper, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Victoria. It's good to see you again. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar where we will briefly discuss my chapter while I'm trying to open my presentation. So yeah, I hope you can all see this. So before we start, I will, as Victoria requested, I'll introduce myself first. I'm Rahmi Kopar. I'm originally from Turkey. I completed my PhD at the University of Dundee, CEPMLP, in 2019, and I worked at Ankara Yıldırım Beyazıt University in Turkey until this August. I delivered lectures on international investment law and energy law there. And then in this August, I came here to Dundee as a visiting fellow, and I'll spend a year until the next August here at the CEPMLP. And finally, I'm listed as an arbitrator at the Energy Disputes Arbitration Center as well. So if we move on to our topic today, I'd like to give you a little bit background about it. This paragraph you see here is the last paragraph of my PhD thesis. So the last section of my PhD thesis was about further research, and I was explaining the areas that might be explored further, and the due diligence requirement was one of these areas. My thesis was dealing with the legitimate expectations principle, and this due diligence obligation is seen as a part of this legitimate expectations principle, which we will see in a minute. Before going into that, we have another piece of self-promotion here. This is my book, which was just published in September by Hard Publishing. And this book actually sets the scene for this further discussion on the due diligence requirement. It deals with the stability and legitimate expectations issues, which are really hot topics these days, especially in the energy investment arbitration. These two concepts are the most discussed ones today, we can say. So what is this chapter about? What does it tell us? We've already seen that it's about the due diligence, but in which context and what this means. We will start with the meaning of due diligence first. I'm sure any practicing lawyer in the M&A area who is dealing with mergers and acquisitions would be very familiar with this concept. A company let's say, wants to buy out another entity, or they want to come together and build a new company, and they go to a law firm and ask for some legal advice. This law firm delves into the documents of these companies. They look for any liabilities, any existing contracts, any obligations, and they also make an inquiry into the domestic laws of a particular country. For example, they will look into the commercial code, they will look into the laws related to competition, and so on, to find out whether there are any potential problems, any potential legal risks in this transaction. So the aim of this due diligence process, as can be understood easily, is to reveal any potential legal risks. But due diligence is not an exclusive term for this legal undertaking. There might be a financial due diligence, there might be a social due diligence, there might be an environmental due diligence. So the term is not being used exclusively for this legal undertaking, but we employ the legal due diligence aspect in this chapter. So the chapter starts with defining this due diligence term first, and then we move on to the international investment arbitration area. When we look into this area, we always see the fair and equitable treatment standard there, because it's the most used investment protection standard today. Almost in every investment arbitration case, you will come across with an FET discussion. The investors will claim that the host state has violated the FET standard under the treaty, and the host states will defend themselves against this claim. And why everyone uses this standard? Because there's no strict definition for this. The problem with the FET standard is that we don't know what it means, right? Bilateral investment treaties include this FET standard, and they're mostly similar terms. And what they tell is basically that the host state must treat the foreign investor fairly and equitably. There's no further definition under these treaties as to what fair and equitable mean. Now we have a treaty clause at hand which obliges the host state to provide the foreign investor a fair and equitable treatment. And we have this investment dispute where the investor claims that the host state breached the fair and equitable treatment standard under a BIT. And this case comes before an arbitral tribunal. As we've said, there is no definition of what fair and equitable treatment means. So the arbitrators here will give a meaning to these terms. They will first define its contours, and then they will apply this definition to the facts of the case. And I'll not go into the details here, but I'll just say that while doing this, arbitrators have specified several elements for the FET standard. They've created several components, and the legitimate expectations principle is one of these elements. And this principle is one of the elements that we use in defining what fair and equitable treatment means. It's actually the most dominant element of the FET standard nowadays. So today, as I've said, it's hard to find a case where there's no breach of the FET claim. And it's also harder to find an FET claim where there's no violation of legitimate expectations principle debate underlying it. So the chapter first explains this fair and equitable treatment standard and some debates surrounding it, and then it moves on to the legitimate expectations principle. So as I've said, the legitimate expectations principle is one of the elements of the FET standard. It's actually the most important element, as I said, when we ask what a fair and equitable treatment is. The answer is that mainly respecting the legitimate expectations. So respecting the legitimate expectations of the investor is what is understood as a fair and equitable treatment today, alongside the other components as well. So the host state actions that don't respect the legitimate expectations of investors might be in breach of the fair and equitable treatment standard. Now, we know that a host state must respect the legitimate expectations of investors, but what is a legitimate expectation then? This principle is originally a domestic law principle. It's found under, especially under administrative laws of many states. Maybe it's present in your legislations as well. And its transfer into investment law is a relatively new one. It's been there for a long time under administrative laws, under domestic laws, but we did not have the legitimate expectations principle under international investment law 20 years ago. We did not have that 20 years ago at all. So arbitral tribunals, while trying to give a meaning to the FET standard, borrowed this concept from domestic laws and developed it within the context of investment law. And its most basic understanding on the domestic laws is that it's about getting public bodies to do what they said they would do. This is the most basic understanding of what a legitimate expectation mean under domestic laws. So you get the public bodies do what they promised you before. So if a state or any of its bodies tell you something, as a citizen, you expect the state to stick to that word. This is how the principle is perceived under administrative laws. And when we come to the investment law, it's only 2003 that we saw this principle being mentioned in an arbitral decision. It's the famous TechMed case, and there the tribunal mentioned basic expectations. And this was not even legitimate expectations back then. It was only basic expectations. And the tribunal mentioned this as an element of the FET standard, of the fair and equitable treatment standard. And this was the first case ever. And legitimate expectations principle basically tries to protect you from broken promises of the host states. It says that if the state has given a promise to the foreign investor, and if the investor has made its investment relying on this promise, then we should protect that reliance, right? This promise might be given in different forms. The most obvious one is the contractual, as in the form of contractual clause. So if there is a contract between the host state and the foreign investor, then we have a source for legitimate expectations there. We have some promises, some obligations, some undertakings under these contracts. That's what a contract means in essence. So the second form is the administrative representations and promises. So a host state might give certain promises to foreign investors by means of administrative representations. When we say administrative representation, this might be anything. There are no restrictions to that. It might be a license, for example. Let's say the Energy Ministry gives you a license to conduct certain operations, and you, as the foreign investor, make some investments relying on that license, right? Or it might be a document produced by a state entity, state institution. It might be a letter sent from the ministry which tells you that everything is fine, just go make your investment, your permission has been granted, just this kind of a letter. So we don't have a restricted list as to what might be an administrative representation or promise that can create legitimate expectations. It will depend on the circumstances of the case. And the last source that might create legitimate expectations is the general legislative and regulatory framework in a host state. So according to this, the laws and regulations existing in a country might form the basis for legitimate expectations. What we see in the energy industry, and especially in the renewable sector, is that states regulate these areas through laws and regulations or decrees, and they do not sign separate contracts with foreign investors. Resource-rich countries might sign separate contracts like production sharing agreements or other kinds with one or two large foreign energy investors, but this is not the case most of the times in the renewable energy part, because here you have many small and medium scale investors, and it's just not possible to, and it's not feasible to negotiate separate contracts with each of these. Instead, you create laws and regulations to design that area, and the foreign investors naturally rely on these domestic laws, right? Because there is nothing more than that. That law or regulation is the legal document that regulates the area, and you have to base your investment on these legal documents. So you make a law as a state, and there you say, if you make an investment in wind or solar energy sector, I'll pay you a fixed amount of money for the electricity you generate for the next 15 years. And the foreign investor makes its investment taking these laws into consideration. And with this, the general legislative framework in a host state creates legitimate expectations on the investor side. Of course, there are many detailed discussions about each of these sources. I will not go into the details of these right here. It is enough to say that these are the sources that might create legitimate expectations: contracts, administrative representations, and general legal framework. These can create legitimate expectations to be protected under international investment law, under the fair and equitable treatment standard. Now, we've established that the fair and equitable treatment standard is the most used investment protection standard today, and since it does not have an exact meaning, arbitral tribunals define it through its elements. Among these elements, sorry, this is the correct one. So, and the protection of legitimate expectations is the most important one, as we said. And we've also seen what a legal due diligence is. It's about looking into the laws, regulations, contracts, and any other legal documents related to an investment. When a foreign investor goes into another state and makes an investment, it might work with a law firm in order to understand the legal environment it goes into. As we've seen, the promises create legitimate expectations. These promises might be in several forms, and while deciding whether there is a legitimate expectation, we look for a reasonable reliance on these promises. If the investor reasonably relies on these promises, then they might be protected if they are broken in the future. And while analyzing this reasonableness issue, arbitral tribunals have created certain tests, and one of the criteria is to check whether the investor had conducted a due diligence before making its investment. Some tribunals tie the reasonableness of the expectations to the existence of a due diligence process. They say, if you've looked into the legal framework of the state, if you've made your analysis and decisions, taking the laws and regulations and the risks into account, then we might consider your investment as being reasonable and being worthy of protection. And the question is whether there is an obligation to conduct due diligence or not. Is that an obligation for investors? As always, we don't have a consensus here. You see two arbitral awards from 2019 here. The first one is Stadtwerke and the second one is Soles. These are both against Spain. Their factual backgrounds are very similar. The main disputed issue is the legitimate expectations in both of these cases. And these are the approaches of the tribunals towards due diligence. Stadtwerke tribunal says that for such an expectation to be reasonable, it must also arise from a rigorous due diligence process. And the Soles tribunal says that a formal due diligence process is not a precondition to a successful claim of legitimate expectations. So again, as always, we have two schools of thoughts here. One line of awards require a rigorous, detailed due diligence into the legal framework of the host state, and the second line of awards do not consider this as a condition to be protected by the fair and equitable treatment standard. So the chapter will look into these arbitral decisions and will explain these two strands in the arbitral practice. Both approaches have some positive and negative aspects, and we will touch upon both these. So to conclude, we can say that we are witnessing a new invention of the arbitral tribunals again. We're not surprised here by this, because the whole FET standard has developed in the very same way. As we've seen, there was no legitimate expectations principle associated with the FET standard 2 decades ago. It seems that arbitral tribunals will continue emphasizing the importance of due diligence in creating legitimate expectations. It's therefore suggested to international energy investors to undertake a certain level of due diligence. And the next problem is related to this sentence, actually. What is that certain level? We have another problem of identifying the limits and the form of this due diligence process. If you're talking about an obligation, tribunals must provide a guidance on the form and limits of such a process. This obligation must be identifiable. Currently, we don't know what form should this due diligence take. Some tribunals are content with a written legal advice from a law firm, but would just 2 pages of a legal advice be enough? Or do you have to look into every small detail in a legal framework in a host state? Or I'm a lawyer myself, can I not just look into these laws and deduce a conclusion without consulting to any other law firm, without receiving any written advice? Or what if I have not conducted any legal due diligence, but I make my investment relying on some other big corporations who went into the same sector at the same time with the same conditions under the same legal framework? So am I not going to be protected by the legitimate expectations principle in case of a dispute just because I did not conduct a due diligence? So legitimate expectations are created by objective criteria. That's what we say while we are discussing this principle. If the objective analysis of a legal framework justifies the investor's reliance on it, will just the lack of due diligence remove the right for that protection? So these are some of the questions that need to be addressed by arbitral tribunals, and I will also try to add my own perspective in this book chapter. Also, I will discuss if we are looking into a new concept, or is it just a new version of the prudent investor or reasonable care concepts that we all already know. So I've tried to summarize my chapter. Of course, due to the limited time, I could not go into the details of each of these issues. If you are interested in this topic, until our book has been published, you can read Yulia Levashova's article on a very similar topic with some different aspects on certain issues. It was published last year and it covers many of these areas that we've just discussed. So this would be the end of my presentation. Thanks for joining, and thank you again, Victoria, for organizing this edited book and this webinar series. And that's it from me today.
All right, thank you very much. And I note that we are live on YouTube. So for the people on the webinar, I know as we don't have many, do you have any questions? But as we are waiting for the questions, Rami, I would like to ask, with respect to international arbitration, and also considering the fact that now many countries are getting into international arbitration, they're embracing dispute resolution. What would be your recommendations in ensuring that both the international investors, but also the national investors apply the same standards of due diligence when it comes to energy investments?
Yeah, so the issue with due diligence is that the concept is not clear right now in the investment arbitration. So we are talking about a whole different due diligence as well, which is for the states. So we also oblige the states to apply due diligence in their behaviors. But this is something totally different than what we discuss here. And for the due diligence on the investor side, it's not clear today, as I've said, how the arbitral tribunals will go, in which direction they will go. That's why I suggest to international investors, international energy investors especially, to conduct a legal due diligence anyways, even if we theoretically think that it's not an obligation on the investor side, even if we theoretically do not agree with the some arbitral decisions. You don't know what will happen 5 years later in the arbitration process. That's why from today, they must be really careful for the potential disputes that might come up in the future. And that's why they might go to a law firm and make it really clear that they are doing this due diligence in order to prevent any investment law crisis in the future. So that in that way they will be able to prevent what the arbitrators might say against them 5 years later. And for the host state side, it's just that they also have to make it very clear in their laws and regulations about which guarantees, which assurances they give to foreign investors. So they should be really careful. This is the basis of many investment arbitration cases lately. In some part, on the host state part, there is a law which gives some assurances when you read it, but the host state argues in the investment arbitration process that this is not a guarantee, right? So if you don't intend on giving a guarantee, then just make it clear while you're designing this legal framework. So that's a suggestion for host states, and for the energy investors, I've already told that.
All right, thank you very much for the brilliant presentation. Since this was a very short webinar, I would suggest to our participants to look out for this book chapter and also look out for our entire book. Remember, it's going to be a live book project. So whenever the chapters are ready, they'll be published with Palgrave, which is also part of Springer. So do look out for our book project on international arbitration in the energy and mining sectors. And also do look out for Dr. Copper's book chapter on due diligence for international energy investors. Do you have any concluding remarks before we end the webinar?
That would be it. I wish everyone a good day. And as you said, please go and read our book chapters when they're published. We will also be sharing these on our social media accounts as well. And you can also reach them via the websites of the publishers too. So thank you very much, Victoria, for this webinar series. I've been watching the previous ones as well, and they're all really informative. And thanks for all your efforts.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you very much for accepting our invite to present during this webinar, but also to write a book chapter for this book project. So this marks the end of our webinar. We are live on YouTube. Do not forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Do follow Dr. Victoria Nale. Also follow Dr. Copper because he's also on social media. And all the videos are available on our website, which is for Nale Energy and Minerals Consultancy. And this webinar was supported by different institutions, including the Energy Disputes Arbitration Center, that is in Turkey, where both me and Dr. Copper are energy arbitrators. And it was also supported by the Institute for Oil, Gas, and Petroleum, which is in Nigeria, and that's where Professor Damilola works as the director. And lastly, it was also supported by the African Energy and Minerals Management Initiative, an NGO where I serve as the executive director. So do follow us, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and look out for this book chapter and the entire book on international arbitration in the energy and mining sectors. This marks the end of our webinar. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Nice. See you.